My name is Katie Sandwell. I work with the Transnational Institute. We're an activist think tank based out of Amsterdam, but working internationally, and I work in our agrarian and environmental justice program. I would say I see just transition as a framework for thinking about how we will make the kinds of changes that we need to make to address the climate crisis. And I think the kind of core animating sentiment or principle of a just transition is that the people who have been most affected by the current system should not be the ones who are bearing the costs of the transition. So yeah, as I've said, just transition is is a general framework. And I think it's important to note that it's a framework that's being contested or struggled over. So people are putting forward their own very different definitions of it. So I think it's up to movements, to communities, social movements and regions who are involved in change processes to kind of articulate and define their own visions of just transition. With that said, we've participated in a couple of interesting processes working with labor and environmental justice movements to do that. And in one of those processes, which was a workshop that we held in 2019, we came up with a series of 6 principles that, to me, hold up pretty well, but of course others are elaborating other principles. But the first of those was that a just transition looks different wherever it's happening. It looks different in different places, and it will mean different things based on the social justice and the environmental justice struggles that people are confronting. The second was that just transition across the board is a class issue. It's a kind of analysis or a framework that tries to put the needs of working people and of communities at the center of change rather than the needs of shareholders of companies. In the third place, a just transition is a feminist issue, is a gender issue. So it needs to recognize the role and the empowerment of women, the solutions that are being brought forward by women, but also the role of kind of care and reproductive work and the work that women do to keep the world ticking forward. Also an anti-racist framework, so a framework that explicitly recognizes the role of racism in contemporary capitalism and works to address that, to change that. Just transition is also bigger than just the climate, it's bigger than just CO2 emissions, right? It takes a broader perspective on the environment and looks at different kinds of environmental destruction, biodiversity loss, all of these kinds of wider issues. And then finally, it's about democracy. It's a framework that really foregrounds the role of people to determine what a transition should look like, what their energy system should look like, and what their food and other systems should look like. Yeah, so I mean, I'll start by saying that I am not from the region. I've engaged a little bit with movements and activists in North Africa, but obviously I think the people who should be playing a really central role in defining this agenda are the people in the region themselves, who have much more knowledge of the issues than anyone coming from the outside perspective. And then secondly, I guess I would say I think it's very important that, I spoke earlier in my definition of just transition about it being a framework that puts working people, puts work at the center of the conversation. But I think when we say that, it's really important to have this very broad understanding of work and to realize that in the world today, a lot of people who are the most exploited people are working in conditions that are informal, that are precarious. Maybe they're doing care work in the home or domestic work. Maybe they're doing unpaid work. Maybe they're working as migrant laborers. And I think that all of those kinds of work really need to be at the center, as well, obviously, as organized and unionized labor, but that we need to have this very broad conception of working people. So I think there are a number of ways that international movements and networks and international solidarity can support localized struggles. I think an important one that we found in a lot of our work that we do, especially with human rights defenders, is really very basic solidarity work that in a context especially where people are dealing with a repressive state or with human rights violations, international awareness can really help to protect people from certain forms of repression. Not always, but ideally. But then I think there's also a big role for kind of learning across and through networks, for South-South exchanges, for building kind of shared inspiration and learning from each other's case studies and exchanging on different kinds of good practices that can be used to advance change. So those are two important dynamics that I see.